All right, we're gonna talk quickly about ACL injuries. I think we think of this injury, obviously we know that ACL injuries are a big problem because the time that you're out from your sport and the rehab and the surgery that has to go along with it, it's not, it's not a light matter. But more and more research is coming out showing us that when the ligament is torn, it's more than just an issue of rehabbing a torn ligament and doing some strengthening exercises. So I want to explain that. So ACL injury, obviously, again, I mentioned it's a ligament that tears. So there's what we call the musculoskeletal effects from that. So the effects of the muscular and the skeletal system in the body and how they interplay. When you don't have that ligament, you don't have the stability in your knee that needs to be reconstructed, and the rehab that goes along with that requires a lot of strength, re-strengthening and restoring all those things that you are no longer able to do because you don't have the ligament. We are learning more and more effects of other body systems too. So the cardiovascular system is another thing that's affected. When you aren't able to work out or train or play your sport, there's a detraining effect that happens. Basically, you don't have that level of fitness that you used to. That obviously is an issue, and needing to rebuild that in the right way when the body is able to handle the loads of working out is important. We're also finding out that from the scar, from the surgery, from the surgical incision, there are some issues with the skin and sensation. Oftentimes the athletes I work with complain about, their numbness around their knee that lasts, but we're learning that some of that can actually affect the body in the long term, because you're losing kind of that sensation around your knee, which can affect kind of your balance and different things that go along with it. The psychosocial effects, this is a topic for probably a whole nother talk on itself, because I think it's a very important topic and it can go more in depth. But the athlete that has torn their ACL is not playing their sport. They're no longer in contention for whatever they were trying to train for. And there's a whole lot of things that go along with that. There's also the confidence in their leg that they had lacked. Once you go through this injury, it's hard to kind of trust your knee again, and we have to rebuild that. So there's a whole lot of psychosocial issues that go along those terms too. And then lastly, the nervous system. That's what we're going to talk about today. We knew that there was some role in the nervous system in ACL rehab, but there's more and more research coming out showing that this link between the two, that we really need to address both all of these systems, but the nervous system and the musculoskeletal system, as well as the other ones that I mentioned. So the reasoning for this. So what ends up happening in ACL injury is you have this ligament that ruptures, and our ligaments have some sensory properties to them. There are some kind of nerve, I'm going to call it nerve endings, but it's a little bit more than that. There's receptors in our ligaments that help our body know where it is in space, meaning that there are ligaments in my ACL that when I bend and strain my knee, when I run, when I cut, when I plant on it, that ligament is sending signals up to my brain to tell my brain that I'm running and planting and cutting on it and whatnot. When you rupture that ligament, it disrupts that signal up to the brain. As a result, so we have an alteration in the signal from the body back up to the brain, but then as a result, there's also a disruption in the system back down from the brain to the nerve itself. It alters the signal from the nervous systems down to the muscles. As a result, then we have a alteration in the reflexes that happen in the body, more so than just like the reflexes you have when you go to the doctor and they tap on your knee. There are other reflexes that are altered, and that ends up altering our movement. So we're not moving the same way after ACL reconstruction and rehab even. Both voluntary, I mentioned the people talk about how they're unable to trust their leg or their knee. So they move differently because of that, but then also involuntary. And more research is showing that even though people feel like they have the ones that feel like they have rehabbed it right away very well and that they're strong enough, that there are some changes in movement patterns. For example, there are studies coming out showing that the biomechanics of how people squat and run and jump, hop on their leg, are altered for a good long time after ACL injury. There are studies on people jumping on their leg that are over a year out after surgery. These are people that fully rehab their knee, that their mechanics are a little bit different. And there's differences in running seen from the 4 to the 12-month mark. We don't know if they've lasted beyond because we just haven't studied that point, so we can only infer there. But if the 4-month mark, it's kind of it makes sense. Like, you're probably not as strong, you're probably not ready, but to see a person that's gone through rehab and that they have changes in how they look when they're running at the year mark, when if anybody's rehabbed their knee, you know that you're working on those kinds of things well before the year mark. It's pretty staggering to understand. And these studies were done on treadmills looking at the biomechanics of the leg that didn't have surgery, that had no changes. So it's not even like they've, people sat around and weren't able to run and that's why they had changes. The non-surgical leg didn't have any issues, and the surgical leg still had issues that persisted through the year mark. Again, this becomes an issue for, obviously, if you have an issue with running and we have an issue with our signals from our brain to our knee, all sports require quickness. So you need to be able to make decisions quickly when you're playing a sport. So if I'm running down a soccer field and I can tell that there's a defender closing in on me, I need to quickly make a decision. Am I going to pass the ball? Am I going to cut and turn a different way? Am I going to try to fake out the person that's running behind me? What am I going to do? When we have those movement patterns altered, obviously there's going to be an issue there where we get people back to sports. The way that our brain works to do those movements is we work in two ways. One, our body kind of bases things on previous experiences. So if I'm running down the soccer field, and I've done this a million times, and I know that a defender's closing down on me, I know that I'm going to have to do something quickly, otherwise I'm going to get the ball stolen. Let's say I am not able to get rid of the ball quick enough, and the defender catches up to me and does steal the ball. My brain is going to think, well, I needed to get rid of that quicker. And it's going to kind of update what we call like the programming in the brain to make sure that the next time that happens, my alarms go off a little bit more, like, get rid of it. You need to get rid of it quicker. That's how our body works. When you have changes in your movement pattern after ACL surgery, what ends up happening is those movement patterns, that programming that our brain does, is changed, and the updates don't update in the way that they should. Think about like an update from your app or your phone that is kind of a faulty update. We're getting just misinformation again and again in our body. So one other thing that we end up seeing is there are actually changes in the brain. They've done functional MRIs where they've looked at brain patterns on people who have had ACL injury, and there are changes seen in the areas of the brain that have to deal with cognition, that have to deal with your like senses and understanding like the integration of like the world around us with our bodies, and then also with motor control. Even more so, we have something that kind of starts with the spinal cord and kind of affects our muscles, our quadriceps muscle, which is the big muscle on your thigh, and that's called arthrogenic muscle inhibition. That's a kind of a big word, or you can think of it as just AMI. And just understand that this is important, even though it's kind of a strange concept, but our muscle ends up being basically shut down. If anybody has gone through ACL surgery, you will know what this feels like. You just have trouble getting your quad to work. So it's hard to do certain things. It's hard to do heavy squats. It's hard at the bottom of the squat. It's hard to do lunges, things that use that muscle. You don't feel like your muscle's firing the right way. So what ends up happening is you have basically the muscle's not activating well because it's happening, it's signal from the spinal cord to the quad muscle is not signaling properly. And then you have these long-standing deficits. You have this decrease in strength, and it's really stemming from a neurological thing. So yes, the muscle needs to get stronger, but there's also kind of the cause of it is more than just muscular. It's caused by swelling and pain. So what it's basically our body is trying to help us. You've had this injury and your knee is really swollen, and then you've had surgery and your knee is really swollen, and it's very painful. And so your body does this protective thing where it tries to protect itself by just like shutting down the muscles around it, because it's kind of I'm trying to think of like not a prehistoric, but it's a very old kind of reflex that we have in our body, that if we kind of shut down the area around the joint, maybe we won't want to run and jump on it, which obviously we don't at that stage, but it's kind of like our body's natural inclination to kind of shut those things down to prevent us from doing something on. It's a protective mechanism. That's the word I was looking for. So really what we need to understand is when we're rehabbing ACL, people after ACL surgery, we need to understand that you need to integrate both. It's a strength thing, but it's also you need to integrate the nervous system. And there's a lot of research coming out about doing things like reaction training and cognitive training. So you're doing strength exercises or different things while you're working your brain to kind of train that reaction time. You're doing a lot of balance work where you're trying to reconfigure the nervous system to kind of get that position sense of where the knee is in space. I'm going to leave you with a couple of things even early on in the post-op process that I think is important. Some new research is showing that AMI, that muscle inhibition, happens because of swelling and pain. So why don't we try to do a better job of getting the swelling and pain coming down, to get that down? Oftentimes after people do their rehab exercises, we will have them ice afterward because they're probably sore. There is some research coming out showing that ice and just trying to ice and cool down that area before exercise will kind of reduce the pain and will start to reduce that muscle inhibition. Also using electrical stimulation on a setting called TENS, which is basically a pain control setting, can also help. You can use both at the same time for 15, 20 minutes before you do your rehab exercises. That gives you kind of what we call this like therapeutic window where things are feeling better, we can start to get the quad firing. And if we can, better we could start to get that quad muscle firing again, the more successful we're going to be with those exercises and the stronger we're going to get it, and trying to prevent some of these things that I talked about later on down the line. The other thing we can do is, I mentioned electrical stim, we can use it for pain relief, but we can also use it on a setting called neuromuscular electrical stim. That is a setting where it tries to actually get the muscle to fire. So you put the sensors on and it actually squeezes your muscle for you. So it can kind of help. I like to have people do this and then actually try to actively use their quad on top of it. So like do this and then try to raise their leg or something so that they're actively using their brain, but then also having the stim unit kind of help out. The new standard of care, because we used to stim people all the time, then we've gotten away from it. When I first got out of PT school, this was like it's kind of a passive thing. Like you should have people actively be working their quad. Now we're finding that it really is a standard of care that we need to use that in addition to exercises. So doing that for at least 6 weeks after surgery really does optimize the quad, and it's really important to do.